The niche genre of asymmetrical multiplayer horror games is one that has always been dominated by Dead by Daylight since it was widely recognised as a genre back at the game's release in 2016. There have been a multitude of games that emerged and tried to rival the title, but every single one of them has since fallen into obscurity or just straight up shut down. And this is really interesting to me because you would think that a game with such a monopolistic nature in a horror game market would actually be scary, but in all honesty, it really isn't. Sure, in your first 10 games you'll get scared upon hearing the terror radius of the killer, but after that feeling of dread quickly fades away, you become more and more confident and less scared. By the time you reach around 10 hours of total playtime, you'll more than likely barely even flinch at the sound of the killer approaching. You subconsciously start to treat it more like a competitive than horror game, and apart from the occasional new killer or perk that you come across, nothing really seems to scare you. This is the trap that I and countless others have fallen into, where we forget that we are playing a horror game as every trick in the book has been used on us and oftentimes becomes repetitive. There are only so many times that hearing the distant sound of a killer's terror radius approaching can be scary to an individual, and I believe that this is the problem that lies in the debate of calling Dead by Daylight a horror game. To put it simply, it's repetitive. Not necessarily the design of killers, in fact some of those are very unique, but a vast majority of them rely on scaring people in the exact same way. Almost every killer in the game relies on either the terror radius or the lack of a terror radius to scare the player. Of course there are going to be outliers which differ at varying levels, but you can categorise almost all of the 39 playable killers into these two sets. That being said, there is one character which differs from the rest majorly. Their arrival to the game built on previously oversaturated elements and added a unique twist, turning what was once a predictable jump scare into pure unfiltered terror. It doesn't matter how many hours you have in the game, be it tens, hundreds or even thousands, this killer will scare you. No other character is like it in this sense, and seeing Dead by Daylight's more recent original releases most likely never will be. The killer in question that I am talking about here is none other than the Dredge. The Dredge, or Druiny as it's called in the lore, is in my opinion Dead by Daylight's first truly successful attempt at trying to create a terrifying killer. The only real attempt before this to create a killer scary in both gameplay and lore was the Doctor, who honestly would have taken the spot on this video over Dredge if behaviour didn't remove the gameplay mechanics that made him scary to play against. But unlike him, the Dredge has stood the test of time and 3 years later still remains terrifying. And for these reasons, and being part of what convinced me to play Dead by Daylight in the first place, I'd like to do a small analysis of why the Dredge still coined the title of the scariest original character out of the 23 present in the game as of recording. And what better place to start than his lore? Dredge's lore starts out with setting the scene on an island called The Fold, a small community which was essentially a utopia. Otto Stamper was the leader of this community and was obsessed with making sure the residents were always happy and chanting good thinking mantras. He was so obsessed with this that anybody who even dared to think about anything negative was swiftly met with exile, wishing to retain the almost perfect island he had built. But slowly, darkness started to seep through the cracks and infected the once vibrant society. People went missing left and right, and rumours started spreading about a creature of the dark engulfing people to add to its own mass. Everything started falling apart, and those who remained gathered in only a few homes, continuously chanting the good thinking mantras that Otto was obsessed with in a desperate attempt to rid them of the creature. Desperate measures were evoked, and people were restricted to only their homes, with Otto stating that malcontents were within their ranks and they alone summoned the evil within. But people still went missing. Frustrated, Otto put his final plan into action. He grabbed a journalist and held her out on a makeshift stand at the beach, claiming she alone was the imposter and the reason everybody had gone missing. However, she had her own story to tell and shouted out the truth to everyone. This paradise was funded by billionaires in the shadows who never meant to create perfect living conditions. They were there to sacrifice anyone and everyone to an elder god beyond their comprehension. Those banishments and exiles I was talking about before were guises for Otto and his guardians to torture and sacrifice people to this mysterious creature, and those gathered before her would be next. Without hesitation, Otto killed her in front of everyone and claimed it to be lies. Years of suppressed emotion rose up in the crowd all at once. People turned on each other in violent nature. Disillusion and senseless bloodshed dominated the scene. They were killing each other, brutally. Limbs were being ripped amongst skulls being crushed, all the while Otto stood there looking down at the carnage with a pitiless facial expression. When it was all over, the floorboards beneath Otto began creaking as a murder of crows circled above. The ground rose into a sick oozing mud, and a formless creature squelched out of the muck to feast. It slowly picked its way through the carnage, absorbing the darkness, savouring the misery, trailing terrible noises. Shrieks, cries, whimpers, pops, cracks, the whole lot. Sounds of feasting, sounds of death, sounds of darkness. Otto watched on as the creature slowly began manifesting into the very thing he and others had imagined, the dredge. It slowly turned to stare at Otto for a long but silent moment, then trudged back away into the shadows that it came from. This lore is amongst my favourites of any present in Dead by Daylight for a multitude of reasons. First is how it takes what would otherwise be a mundane and overdone trope of cults sacrificing people and turns it into something different, a system of mistrust and disillusion. The people aren't aware that Otto is tricking them and are none the wiser until it is all too late. It might be a bit rich to say this, but it begs the question of who was the real villain in this story between Otto and the Dredge. Of course it would be simple to say Dredge as he is a manifestation of dark thoughts, but arguably he's more of a force of nature than inherently evil. It only acts out of instinct, while Otto acts out of malice. Nothing he did was necessary, and this is implied to not even be the first time he has done something like this. Another reason I love the lore is Otto Stamper's character. Some of you may know this, but Druini's lore isn't the first time that Otto Stamper appears in Dead by Daylight. He dates all the way back to May 2017 alongside the release of Herman Carter, aka the Doctor, and was also a key character in that lore. I'm not going to go over it as I can see myself making a whole separate video on the Doctor, but it's cool to see recurring characters. I especially love how he is purely evil and, as previously stated, arguably more so than the Dredge itself. There is no justifiable reason to encompass such hatred for people that he would start running a cult ran by a shadow government. It was done out of rancor and morbid curiosity. Psychopaths are honestly amongst my favourite character tropes in fiction, and whilst Otto isn't up there as one of my favourite, he's still a character that I appreciate nonetheless. A third reason I love the lore is actually because of the add-ons utilised for Dredge's kit. For those of you who don't know, add-ons in Dead by Daylight are basically perks but unique to the character or items kit. They have many functions and can completely change a character's gameplay or simply just provide a small stats boost. But what I'm more interested in is the tiny smidget of lore that each of them provide for their character. I could sit here and talk about each add-on individually for another 20 minutes, but that's not exactly appealing for everybody. Instead, I'm going to hone in on 3 add-ons now that add to the terrifying nature of his lore, and later a few more that add to the scare factor of his gameplay. The first of these is the Burnt Letters, which reads, "Some followers tried to write letters home. Stamper ensured that nobody would have contact with the outside world." It adds even more to the aesthetic of isolation this short passage creates, and as well adds to Otto's controlling personality. It tells us that followers were so controlled that they couldn't even talk to their family overseas. Not only is this morbid to think about by itself, but it actually relates to how cults in real life would adopt similar tactics, often targeting people at their lowest and alienating them from the outside world. The boat key add-on is similar to this, stating only one boat allowed people on and off the island, and the keys were hidden away to prevent deserters. The purpose between both of these items' lore is shared, which is to show how secluded the fold is from the rest of the world, and how little chance there is of escape. This third item, however, became harrowing to read after I realised what it was revealing, and that is the Broken Doll. It states, followers brought their families to live in a utopia. None of them were spared. Which outright confirms that innocent children also fell victim to both Otto and Dredge. And that is something which I can respect with horror games, not holding back with trying to create frightening imagery. I would also like to briefly touch on the possible inspirations for Dredge as well, as I feel it can still be relevant to this discussion. After some small researching, I came up with 2 distinct sources which could have inspired Dredge. Although nothing is confirmed, I think they both bear a striking resemblance to how he came to be. The first is an ancient Greek creature called an egregore, a non-physical entity that arises from the thoughts of a community, often cults. The link is obvious with it arising from thoughts alongside being commonly associated with cults. Although unlike Dredge, it does not have to be malevolent thoughts, simply a collective of them. Don't quote me on this part, but I also believe that an egregore is a non-physical entity and only exists as a collective of thoughts, but that could be wrong as the articles on it were a bit confusing for me to read. That can even be partly said for Dredge, who for a good while in his respective lore was hinted to be a non-physical entity and merely a collection of thoughts. The second and more prevalent example is Pyramid Head, again being created through dark thoughts. This time though, it was bad thoughts, more specifically a manifestation of guilt from the protagonist of Silent Hill. Guilt from blaming yourself for someone's death, which is the case for Silent Hill's protagonist, and doubt mixed with dread from being left isolated on a faraway island can both fall under the umbrella term of negative thoughts. Not only this, but unlike an egregore, Pyramid Head is much more centered around horror. That's not to say that egregores aren't used in horror, but more that they aren't exclusive to it. This isn't ever confirmed, but I believe that a mix of these two creatures may be directly tied to behaviour's creation behind the dredge, taking the cult and intangible aspects from an egregore and combining it with the more recent Pyramid Head's malthinking and horror roots. I will say again, nothing is confirmed for the inspirations of Dredge, and this is all merely speculation by my part, but it was worth including in my view. Tangent aside though, there is one more field of this character that I'd like to look at before touching on his gameplay, which is his appearance. Dredge has a very distinct look which stands out from any other character in Dead by Daylight, as it's one of the only non-humanoid killers in the game. In fact, it was Behaviour's first non-human character, which to this day there are still minimal amounts of. Instead of adopting the classic appearance style that everyone's used to, it takes the form of an oozing cloud with writhing limbs seeping out from it. There's also a distinct lack of symmetry with his character. Previously, Behaviour has incorporated asymmetricality into their killers, such as with Hillbilly and Blight, but never quite on the same scale as Dredge. His model is completely unlike anything we've seen before and quite frankly completely alien. The mountain of skulls weighing down on his back are all the more terrifying when given the context from the lore. There's also a distinct rib of bone sticking out from what appears to be its neck, lining all the way up from the body to the head. Appendages have extra joints which appear far from natural, and some grotesquely enlarged proportions are available for us to see. The more you look at him, the more you see just how wrong he looks, and that's absolutely perfect for what the devs are trying to go for. When I say that nothing looks right, I mean it, because there is no single part that hasn't been distorted in one way or another. And of course everything to do with the looks will link back to the lore. These unrecognisable body parts are what happened to the inhabitants of the fold, reduced to nothing more than a coat for the dredge to roam around wearing. It would make sense to believe that some of these parts are from animals and not just humans, but for the sake of not leering off into any theories, I'm going to say that they're from humans alone. This appearance is terrifying and amongst my top 3 for all of Dead by Daylight's original characters, but one part I neglected was what the dredge actually is. Because whilst everything about its appearance is great, technically it's only the fog. In the lore, it's mentioned that an oozing mass came out to feast on the remains of people, which was actually the dredge's true form. All of the body parts attached to it can be thought of as armour to the core of its being. Unnecessary but also visually appealing to humanity's morbid fascination. Before moving on to gameplay, I would like to add quickly that my favourite part of the whole outfit has to be the dredge's head. Its design uses a relatively rare trope of an extended mouth, in this case vertically downwards. The best example I can think of that is reminiscent of this design and possibly an inspiration are the Gatherers from Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Although I won't go on another whole side tangent about inspirations for looks, I still feel like I should include that here. But ultimately, the lore and inspirations aren't exactly prevalent in the game, and a horror game can be as dark as it wants in story, but if the gameplay itself isn't scary, it has failed at being a horror game in my view. Which is why I made this video, because the dredge's strongest aspect for its fear factor is its gameplay. Earlier, I stated that almost every killer in the game can be boiled down into 2 groups in terms of how they scare players: a terror radius or lack of a terror radius. And whilst yes, the dredge can be grouped with the lack of terror radius, it is the only killer that expands on this idea. There's this mechanic in the game called undetectable, which completely hides the killer's terror radius, forcing survivors to rely purely on visuals to locate their whereabouts. To say this mechanic is used a lot would be an understatement. 8 perks, 9 killers and 21 add-ons use this status effect, which will only increase with the looming release of Springtrap later this month. Out of these 9 killers, Dredge is the only one to actually expand on the status effects instead of simply applying it to themselves. Sadako, Amanda and Wraith can turn it on and off at will, Michael Myers starts trials in it, Skull Merchant deploys zones which grant her it. I think at least, it's hard to keep up with her changelog. Ghostface and Chucky can enter it on a cooldown, and Demogorgon only uses it when teleporting. Dredge can technically be classed with Ghostface and Chucky, where it's entered on a cooldown, but unlike these two, Dredge's ability is more of a charge than a cooldown. And, of course, the greatest reason that makes him terrifying to play against, to an extent the reason I'm making this video, and one of, if not the scariest mechanics in all of Dead by Daylight: Nightfall. This effect not only makes Dredge undetectable, but also engulfs survivors in near total darkness, greatly hindering their vision. Generators, pallets, players, and most importantly, the killer become overwhelmingly hard to see, depriving survivors of any previous visual advantages. Spotting the killer from across the map is impossible now, and by the time you see them, it's most likely too late to do anything about it. Almost any form of safety is gone, as there is no way to detect the killer other than looking around you, as the undetectable status effect that Dredge gains during this time period ignores any attempts for survivors to use their aura reading abilities on him, which, for those of you who don't know, are essentially just wall hacks. If you wish to take this a step further, you can equip the Tilling Blade add-on, which makes survivors suffer from blindness, mangled, and hemorrhaged when injured during Nightfall. The only one which I'm really interested in here is blindness, as it prevents survivors from reading any other auras during this time period. What was previously already a detriment of not being able to see the killer through walls has now been enhanced to not being able to see anything, including other survivors. A sense of loneliness and isolation is created if you're apart from anybody else, as there is nothing you can see apart from what you come into contact with. One of my favourite things to do when playing Dredge is to run this add-on alongside the field recorder, which I'll explain in a minute, and hit somebody then run away. I almost never instantly chase the kill, but instead like to play with people's fears, hitting them once, rendering them weakened and hindered, then leaving to wonder if I'll be back or not. Nyctophobia, the fear of the dark, is a primal sense which resonates with every human being. It's that feeling that makes us feel as if we're being watched, followed, or even hunted when travelling through pitch black. Nightfall encapsulates this perfectly and makes what was just a nightmare reality, as oftentimes you are being chased in the mist. The paranoia created is hugely effective as well, as whether you are physically close to another survivor or not, your presence will always be felt. Especially so is the case when survivors are near lockers. Dredge has a mechanic in or outside of Nightfall where he can teleport to lockers around the map, albeit at the slow rate of 19 meters a second. Survivors can lock these lockers to increase the time that Dredge takes to exit them, which is a massive drawback to Dredge as it over doubles the time it takes to exit lockers. However, during Nightfall, the movement speed between lockers is doubled to 38 meters a second, making traversing and scaring people much faster. A little known fact is that whilst Dredge is teleporting to a locker, the doors of it will ever so slightly open and close periodically as a sort of warning. I would talk about how this mechanic is scary as it prepares survivors for the worst, but realistically it is nowhere near well known enough to talk about it like that. To counter the locks placed on lockers, you can run one of Dredge's best add-ons, the boat key. This primarily increases your movement speed whilst teleporting, but the secondary effects will break all locks when the exit gates are powered. Whilst this definitely isn't a hard counter as it only works during endgame, it's still nice to include and one of my personal favourite add-ons to run. But if I'm talking about his best add-ons that also pair well with scaring players, I feel obliged to mention the field recorder. This add-on makes it so that as soon as the game starts, survivors are instantly plunged into Nightfall, and the same happens when the exit gates are powered. It's effective gameplay wise as it grants Dredge all the advantages of Nightfall from the get-go, and effective at being scary as there's no longer any suspense or build up to it, only the scary parts. If you really want to play Dredge to scare people and don't run this add-on, then you aren't playing him right. But one of my favourite parts about Nightfall is how the Dredge actually looks like he belongs there. As mentioned before, Dredge is Dead by Daylight's first truly monstrous non-humanoid design, so it makes sense that it sort of looks a bit out of place on some maps, particularly those which were made for human characters, such as Larry's Memorial Institute or Dead Dog Saloon. But when Nightfall activates, Dredge truly looks like it belongs in the environment, no matter the map. It completely engulfs the map in a thick black mist where you can't really see anything when it's not within arm's reach apart from the Dredge itself. And when he appears, it looks like he didn't just emerge out of the darkness but was made from it. Whilst the white outline is entirely in place for gameplay reasons, you can interpret it in a way that fits into his lore. Not to get into a power scaling debate here, but Dredge is undeniably one of the most powerful killers in the realm of Dead by Daylight. Not able to rival the entity, but to both be respected and monitored by it. I personally believe that Nightfall in actuality and outside of gameplay restrictions would have been far more deadly and powerful, but the entity nerfed Dredge alongside his mechanics to somewhat create balance. This can also be an explanation as to why Dredge takes so long to travel between lockers and why he has to take a second after exiting them before moving. But my point here is I think that the white outline could be some form of Dredge seeping through the entity's cracks, a glimpse of his true form or nature which was unable to be altered by the entity. Alternatively, you can also see it as Dredge breaking reality itself, as if it was never meant to be physically manifested. Again, Dredge at its core is just a pile of bad thoughts, becoming visible only due to unknown or unexplainable reasons, which could lead you to think that the white outline is his material form breaking away, unable to be held in our visible dimension. Or you could just say that it's for gameplay reasons, which realistically almost definitely is the cause. Nonetheless though, it's fun to come up with our own lore implications for it. And that's Dredge, Dead by Daylight's often regarded as scariest killer, without a doubt earning a place in my top 3 original characters that Behaviour's ever made, and most likely ever will make. To bring everything together on why Dredge is so scary, he builds on already existing scary elements which come from our real life fears. It comes together to create an amazing original character from Behaviour's part, and I truly hope we continue to see more creations like this come to light for Dead by Daylight's future. There are other killers who I would love to make separate videos on as well, going over every aspect about them, possibly even in more detail than Dredge. If you would like to see this, please let me know in the comments below. And I did show this with a small text box before, but all the gameplay footage for this video has come from the channel No Commentary Horror, so a massive thank you to them. I would have got the footage myself, but I'm producing this video in the midst of my A-level exams, so queuing match after match for the small chance of finding one of the lowest picked killers in the game wasn't exactly a viable option. As well, I have realised I haven't properly introduced myself yet. So hello, I'm Aerostatic, Aero for short. I'm 18 and have the horrible mental illness of being British. I'm mainly going to focus this channel around horror media as it's amongst one of my favourite forms of media out there, be it movies, games, or even books and or graphic novels. The character which I've been using as a mascot for this video is called Nith for those interested, and I would be continuing to use them as a mascot for all my social media going forwards. I do have others which will be brought to light one day, but for now I'll continue with this one as the face of my channel. That being said though, thank you all for watching this and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.